The White House, in mid-October of 1962, was a command center just seething with activity.
Right. And inside this command center, you have the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, what we call XCOM.
And they're in the middle of this incredibly intense debate over intelligence that, well, it threatened global catastrophe.
It did, and yet this internal storm, this, high-stakes deliberation, it was completely invisible to the rest of the world.
To non-U.S. shores, even to most of the American government itself.
That invisible secrecy is really the defining feature of this whole initial phase. I mean, while President Kennedy and his inner circle are analyzing these reconnaissance photos, the Soviet Union is operating under this dangerous delusion of its own subtlety.
So Khrushchev is just carrying on as normal.
Completely. He's being briefed daily, of course, on the missile buildup in Cuba,
Right.
but to the world, he's maintaining this facade of business as usual. He's receiving visitors, attending events, making the usual threats against the West.
Presenting a very bland, very accustomed face.
Exactly.
And in Cuba itself, the operational environment was even more bizarre. The buildup of these sites, the ones that would hold offensive nuclear weapons, was being handled with a startling degree of casualness.
It really was. You have Russian military personnel working on these critical sites, but they're often dressed in, check shirts, slacks, shorts.
Taking breaks to go swimming in the sea, even doing some local tourism.
You have to wonder if that was a deliberate psychological tactic, to appear unthreatening, or just gross operational negligence. But whatever the reason, it worked. It fooled the local population.
There are those anecdotes from reporters later. A young mother in Havana, Margarita Rios Albisin, she saw troops, anti-aircraft guns, but she admitted she never realized how serious it all was.
And that local ignorance really speaks volumes. It shows the speed, or maybe the sheer lack of perceived urgency during that initial deployment.
And this ignorance wasn't just in Havana, it was global. It reached even the most trusted U.S. allies.
Key partners, like the British government, were entirely oblivious to the fact that the U.S. administration was debating options that ranged from peace all the way to nuclear war.
You just have to look at the global press from that time to see the distraction.
You do. On October 16th, which was the day the most critical intelligence was confirmed in Washington, the Glasgow Herald was focused on a speech by Admiral Mountbatten.
Calling for disarmament.
Right, calling for disarmament amidst the nuclear stalemate. 2 days later, the London Times headline is about Khrushchev's request for Berlin talks. The documents we have show what they called a stubborn European obsession with matters German.
This fixation on Berlin really created a significant blind spot, didn't it?
It did. And we see this Allied misjudgment playing out in real time. British intelligence officers were actually in Washington at that moment for top-secret meetings.
With people like the CIA's Ray Klein.
Yes. And Klein recorded that his British counterparts repeatedly argued that, and I'm quoting here, the Russians would never put missiles in Cuba because of the risk to their interests in Europe.
That one statement just encapsulates the failure of imagination, really. The failure that permeated the entire Western alliance's thinking.
They believed the Soviets were strictly bound by this rational, European-centric logic. They couldn't fathom the audacity of Khrushchev's gamble, which was so clearly designed to test American resolve.
And while all this was happening, the U.S. intelligence community was working, but their efforts were fragmented.
Intense, but fragmented. I mean, despite the fog, they were highly mobilized.
Mm.
The NSA director, Gordon Blake, he assigned Juanita Moody to lead a nonstop signals intelligence operation. A SIGINT operation.
Intercepting and analyzing communications.
Right. Her team was producing twice-daily electrograms on the readiness of Soviet and Cuban defenses. It was a massive commitment.
But even with all that surveillance, all that work, the administration was, in some really crucial areas, flying dangerously blind.
The most glaring gap was the number of Soviet personnel on the ground. Washington's estimate was somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000.
And the true figure?
The true figure, as history tells us, was 43,000.
43,000. That is a massive discrepancy. I mean, if the U.S. had launched an invasion based on that 10,000 estimate, they'd have faced 4, maybe 8 times the expected ground force.
It would have turned a planned surgical strike into a protracted, bloody conflict, one that would have inevitably provoked escalation.
And that wasn't the only gap.
No, that number was compounded by a severe capability gap. The U.S. was entirely ignorant of the presence of tactical nuclear weapons. The Soviets had deployed Luna short-range rockets and FKR-1 cruise missiles.
Both nuclear-tipped.
Both nuclear-tipped. And these weren't the huge strategic weapons aimed at American cities. These were battlefield nukes. designed for immediate use against an invading force.
So why did those tactical weapons matter so much more in a way than the strategic ones?
They mattered because of the orders. At this stage, the local Soviet commanders had unilateral discretion to launch these tactical nukes
Without consulting Moscow.
without any consultation in the event of an American invasion. This is probably the single most terrifying unknown of the entire crisis. The strategic missiles, the MRBMs and IRBMs, they required a direct authorization from Khrushchev.
But a conventional U.S. invasion could have triggered an immediate, localized nuclear strike.
A strike against landing sites, against naval vessels. It would have initiated a nuclear exchange that no one in Washington had even factored into their initial calculus. The whole basis of deterrence relies on tight civilian control, and here, that control was dangerously delegated to field commanders.
Okay, let's turn to that pivotal moment, the one that really accelerated the crisis. Thursday, October 18th. For a few days, ExComm had been meeting, debating these initial reports.
And while the early photos were concerning, it was the discovery of the intermediate-range ballistic missiles, the IRBMs, that utterly transformed the atmosphere in the room.
The intelligence briefing at 11:10 a.m. that Thursday, that was the game changer.
It was. New U-2 photography unveiled these IRBM sites that they hadn't seen before, 21 miles southwest of Havana.
And these IRBMs, with ranges up to 2,800 miles, they threatened the entire continental United States in a way the shorter-range MRBMs didn't.
Exactly. This single data point immediately caused several of the earlier advocates of caution to shift into a much more hawkish stance.
So how did this affect the key players? Let's start with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He'd been leaning towards diplomacy before this.
He had, but the IRBM seemed to shake him profoundly. He argued that a failure to respond would, quote, undermine our alliances all over the world. It would signal American weakness.
But he didn't abandon diplomacy entirely.
No, he still favored a preliminary diplomatic approach to Khrushchev. He believed the Soviet leader might realize he's got to back down on this. But Rusk was now serious enough to contemplate a declaration of war on Cuba if that diplomacy failed.
That's a significant escalation for a State Department official.
A huge escalation.
And on the military assessment side, you have Robert McNamara, the defense secretary. His strategic assessment is perhaps the most fascinating one.
And the most controversial. He actively opposed the push for limited airstrikes. He favored a full invasion if action was necessary, but, and this is key, only if the ballistic missiles were not yet operational.
But his core argument was revolutionary at the time.
It was. He argued that the nuclear deployment in Cuba did not change the fundamental strategic military balance.
Why not?
Because the U.S. already faced an existential threat from Soviet ICBMs stationed in the USSR. McNamara basically saw Cuba as just adding a few more existential threats to a situation that was already, 100% existentially threatened. He termed the crisis fundamentally a political problem.
A political problem, not a military threat. That's a profound distinction.
It is. The problems he saw were political. Holding the Western alliance together, conditioning Khrushchev for the future, dealing with a terrified American public, and, maintaining international credibility.
So by framing it as a political and optics problem, he was directly countering the Joint Chiefs,
Who saw it as a purely military challenge demanding immediate kinetic action.
Kennedy himself was keenly aware of this political dimension, especially with the Allies. He questioned which action would strain the alliance more. Was it this attack by us on Cuba, which most allies regard as a fixation of the United States and not a serious military threat?
And that's a highly insightful piece of self-critique from the president. He recognized, and he said, that an awful lot of conditioning would have to go on before they would support our action against Cuba because they think we're slightly demented on this subject.
And this reflected what the Allies, particularly the British, were saying privately, that America had a dangerous Cuba fixation.
It did. And Kennedy knew he needed that Allied buy-in. A unilateral surprise attack would have just shattered that international consensus no matter how successful it was in Cuba.
So it was in this environment, recognizing the need for a political off-ramp, that the president introduced a new concept.
The swap. For the first time, JFK mentioned the possibility of exchanging the Soviet missiles in Cuba for the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
And this was a game changer because it introduced a direct path to de-escalation that would, honor Khrushchev's need for some kind of public victory.
Absolutely. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were aging, they were liquid-fueled, highly vulnerable. They were considered obsolete, really. tempting targets.
So McNamara and George Bundy, the national security advisor, they started planning for the fallout.
Right, how to manage it with the Turks. They landed on the idea of promising to deploy Polaris nuclear missile-armed submarines nearby. They were far more survivable, far more capable than the Jupiters, and they hoped that would reassure the Turkish government.
So the core of the XCOM debate then really centered on this choice between a naval blockade, which they later termed a quarantine, and an outright invasion.
And the crucial diplomatic voice arguing against military action was Llewellyn Thompson.
The former ambassador to Moscow.
Right. He provided this deep institutional and psychological knowledge of Khrushchev. His immediate fear about air attacks was that they would inevitably kill a lot of Soviet personnel.
Technicians, advisors, construction workers.
Exactly. And he stressed that such an event would almost certainly oblige Moscow to respond militarily, which would rapidly escalate the crisis and just bypass diplomacy altogether.
So he strongly favored the blockade plan. He argued it put the U.S. in a entirely different posture and much less danger of getting up into the big war.
But he also had this unique insight into Soviet psychology that supported the blockade. He noted their curious faculty of wanting a legal basis.
Even after all the outrageous things they'd done.
Right. Thompson was arguing that if the U.S. framed it correctly, not as a full act of war, but as a quarantine against offensive military weapons, the Soviets would be very reluctant to violate it. Doing so would undermine their own claims of legal sovereignty.
And his personal background informed this. He was the only foreign ambassador ever invited to Khrushchev's private dacha.
He was, and this personal insight was crucial when he advised on how to handle Khrushchev. He urged a secret communication to the Kremlin to prevent Khrushchev from flying a reckless solo course.
Citing the U-2 shoot-down incident from 1960.
Yes, where the Soviet military had stepped in to moderate Khrushchev's more impetuous urges. Thompson's central thesis was to make it as easy as possible for Khrushchev to back down.
But not everyone shared that faith in diplomacy. Robert Kennedy was initially quite hawkish.
He was. He objected to the blockade as a very slow death. RFK worried it would just allow time for global yelling and screaming, giving the Soviets time to consolidate.
And he feared the actual process of stopping ships would lead to conflict.
A boarding party being fired on, a ship being sunk, Soviet planes shot down. He saw it as a path of uncontrolled escalation. Maxwell Taylor, for his part, just urged haste. He wanted an invasion order soon.
But the moral quandary of a surprise attack became the central sticking point for the civilians. George Ball issued that stark warning.
That it was like Pearl Harbor. It's the kind of conduct that one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States.
And that struck a deep chord with RFK.
It did. He understood the geopolitical implications. If the U.S. bombed Cuba without warning, after 15 years of expressing fears about a treacherous Soviet surprise attack, America would be acting in the very way the world assumed only the Soviets would.
He scribbled that famous note, "I now know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor."
The research shows that XCOM spent more time debating the morality and efficacy of a surprise air assault than any other single issue in those first 5 days.
The moral high ground was paramount, especially when you contrast it with the military's almost casual acceptance of nuclear war.
That casual acceptance was laid bare when Maxwell Taylor was asked if a Soviet seizure of West Berlin in response to a U.S. assault on Cuba would lead to a nuclear exchange.
His answer was assented, almost insouciantly. Yes, you have to.
An almost blasé acceptance of annihilation. And that elicited the president's most critical response, the one that defined his entire strategy.
He said the question is, what action we take which lessens the chances of a nuclear exchange, which obviously is the final failure. Kennedy was the one person focused on planetary survival.
And while this intense internal debate was raging, the deception game was playing out on the world stage. That very Thursday, at 5 p.m.
Just hours after the IRBM confirmation.
Right. The president meets with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Kennedy, Rusk, and Thompson have to sit there cradling this devastating secret knowledge, while Gromyko probes for American intentions.
Gromyko's mission was to sustain pressure on Berlin and deflect from Cuba. He called the Western presence in Berlin a rotten tooth which must be pulled out.
Which we later learned was a calculated diplomatic bluff. And when the topic shifted to Cuba, Gromyko just complained about U.S. threats, claiming the Soviets were only supplying defensive weapons.
The sheer gall of it is stunning, considering what Kennedy knew.
It is. Kennedy tried to give him a hint. He read aloud his previous public statements from September warning of the grievous consequences of aggressive weapons in Cuba.
And Gromyko's reaction.
Nothing. He didn't react. He emerged from the meeting, quote, confident that his host knew nothing about the missiles.
His report to Khrushchev was that a U.S. military initiative was almost impossible to imagine.
And Khrushchev later applauded what he called Gromyko's carnival of falsehoods. He said he was lying. And how? And that was the right thing to do. He had orders from the party.
Hmm.
This brazen deception really confirmed for the Americans that any initial diplomatic overture would be futile.
So the next day, Friday, October 19th, the intelligence picture gets worse.
Much worse. New estimates identify a third Soviet MRBM regiment and more sites being prepared for the larger IRBMs. Missile readiness was now expected within a week.
And this new intelligence spurred the military into unified action.
It galvanized them. Before meeting with JFK, the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed to deliver a unified recommendation. A massive surprise attack, followed by an all-out invasion.
Only Maxwell Taylor dissented from the invasion part by this point.
Right, but the push for immediate, devastating airstrikes was overwhelming. They saw the White House's consideration of a blockade as dangerously weak.
The confrontation between the chiefs and the president that Friday is a defining moment. Kennedy first tried to deliver this protracted homily.
Trying to get them to understand Khrushchev's real motive, he argued to them, they don't give a damn about Cuba, and they do care about Berlin and about their own society.
He used Berlin as his primary strategic restraint. He argued an attack on Cuba would give the Soviets a clear line to take Berlin.
And if Berlin was taken, Kennedy warned, it would leave him only one alternative: to fire nuclear weapons, which is a hell of an alternative, and begin a nuclear exchange.
This careful, calculated analysis was met with open disdain by General Curtis LeMay.
The Air Force Chief of Staff, a man known as Iron Ass, he contemptuously rejected this defeatist talk.
He said the U.S. had no choice except direct military action.
His opposition to the blockade was visceral. He warned it was almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. He predicted disaster.
Soviet mobile missiles disappearing into the woods, MiGs and IL-28s attacking U.S. airfields.
He believed the U.S. would drift into a war at a great disadvantage, having sacrificed the element of surprise. And then he launched that direct personal insult at the president.
You're a pretty bad fix at the present time.
And Kennedy, with that dark humor of his, parried the attack. You're in there with me, personally.
It just reveals the immense tension between the political need for restraint and the military drive for immediate victory.
And LeMay's background makes his aggression less surprising. He directed the catastrophic firebombing of Japan. He was notoriously insensitive to the human cost of war.
The man who later advocated bombing North Vietnam back into the Stone Age.
Exactly. His plan was comprehensive. A massive first strike to take out everything. Earliest possible attack date, Sunday, October 21st. And he had firm support from the other chiefs.
The disconnect between the military and civilian leadership in that room was palpable.
Roswell Gilpatrick, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, recalled that Kennedy was just choleric after sessions with LeMay. RFK later noted his disgust at the chief's willingness to go to nuclear weapons.
And JFK himself told an aide those chilling words. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong.
The president's fear wasn't of Khrushchev. It was of his own military commanders.
That Friday ended with the president leaving for a campaign trip, a piece of theater to project normalcy. But he told Bundy to keep the bombing option open.
He was under intense pressure. He knew the political consequences he would face if he rejected the Joint Chiefs' unanimous recommendation for what they saw as a softer option.
Even with the president gone, the debate continued. Men like Atchison, Dillon, McConey, and Bundy still supported the bombing plan.
Even Robert Kennedy, despite his Pearl Harbor qualms, made some hawkish noises, suggesting it might be better for our children and grandchildren if we decided to face the Soviet threat and eliminate it now.
But the momentum shifted decisively back to the naval interdiction.
Primarily because Robert McNamara convinced the administration that a blockade could, if necessary, be followed by airstrikes. It offered graduated escalation, and Llewellyn Thompson strongly supported that.
So the president, feigning a cold, flew back from Chicago. The critical meeting began at 2:30 p.m. on Saturday.
In the Oval Room, not the Oval Office, to avoid alarming the press. And the intelligence update was sobering.
2 fixed IRBM sites, 4 to 5 MRBM sites, and at least 8 of those MRBMs were ready to fire immediately. This was the imminent threat.
McNamara was now the blockade's champion. He argued it was unlikely to precipitate general war, especially since the Soviets couldn't really escort cargo vessels.
But he acknowledged that to resolve the crisis, the U.S. would probably have to trade the Jupiters from Turkey and Italy.
And maybe even set a timeline for giving up Guantanamo. But he insisted the blockade was the only safe starting point.
And the terminology was intensely negotiated.
The term quarantine was adopted instead of blockade, for legal reasons. That was Dean Rusk's successful argument. A blockade implies a state of war.
A quarantine, however, could be interpreted as an interdiction under international law, aimed solely at offensive weapons.
Linking directly to Thompson's insight about the Soviet need for a pseudo-legal basis, Rusk also successfully argued that they must stick to the missile issue, abandoning the secondary objective of getting rid of Castro.
So the consensus was set. Reject immediate military action, reject upfront negotiation, announce the quarantine, insist on missile removal first, then negotiate.
But the single most definitive moment that cemented the decision against an airstrike happened the next day, Sunday, during a briefing with the military planners.
General Walter Sweeney from Tactical Air Command and Colonel Wilbur Creech presented the airstrike plan.
Sweeney, who personally wanted to invade and get rid of Castro once and for all, assured the president of a 98% kill rate of all the missiles on the first strike.
98%, rising to 99% with subsequent waves.
The confidence was total. But Kennedy, always skeptical of military certainty, pressed him. And Sweeney was forced to add the devastating caveat, the one phrase that changed everything.
That is all that we know about.
Aye, that's the rub. That was Kennedy's immediate observation. The admission that there was a 1 or 2% chance that a missile, maybe armed with a nuke, might be unlocated and survive the strike that sealed the fate of the air assault plan.
Colonel Creech later confirmed that they knew in that moment the plan was rejected. The risk of even one unlocated operational nuclear missile being launched was a risk the president was just unwilling to take.
It confirmed his commitment to avoiding the final failure.
So with the quarantine decision locked in, the administration moved rapidly. The first foreigner briefed was David Ormsby Gore, the British ambassador.
A personal friend of JFK. And he immediately endorsed the blockade plan, supporting Kennedy's view over his own prime minister's.
And Kennedy used that meeting to articulate his broader fears that the Cuban deployment was a calculated move to justify action against Berlin.
It showed his sophisticated understanding of Khrushchev's strategy. He was treating Cuba and Berlin as intrinsically linked bargaining chips.
And other key advisors were brought in. Robert Lovett, the former defense secretary.
He supported McNamara's view that the strategic balance hadn't changed, and he helped draft the quarantine announcement.
By Monday, October 22nd, preparations were in high gear. The Navy deployed 40 warships. Detailed rules of engagement were drawn up,
authorizing disabling gunfire, but crucially, requiring explicit permission from Washington to sink a Soviet submarine. They were ensuring tight civilian control, preventing a junior officer from escalating the crisis independently.
And on the home front, the preparations were stark. Operation Quicklift evacuated thousands of dependents from Guantanamo Bay.
They were replaced by 3 additional Marine battalions. There was a simultaneous evacuation and reinforcement, demonstrating maximum readiness.
Diplomatic and media control were paramount. Congressional leaders were flown back to Washington for briefing.
And Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, successfully requested that the Washington Post and the New York Times hold the story until after the president's broadcast.
A rare display of media self-censorship that let the administration control the narrative.
The final touch was the speech itself. JFK rejected, including a summit meeting with Khrushchev in the draft. He felt it suggested weakness. He also deleted bleak and frightening words about the horrors of war.
Opting for a tone of firm resolve, not panicked alarm, the administration agreed on a 2-day delay to brief allies, holding the public announcement until Monday evening, October 22nd.
That's when the quarantine would be announced and enforced, setting the stage for the most intense and dangerous phase of the crisis.
That period between Thursday and Monday, it was the decisive pivot. A pivot from chaotic brainstorming to a calculated decision.
The choice for a quarantine was a wise compromise. It was driven by a fear of that final failure, and the realization that if the U.S. started the shooting, they would lose the moral high ground and surrender control over the trajectory of escalation.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.